From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
And you have this incredible charade taking place, which the world is looking at with utter astonishment. Poor, miserable people, families, mothers, children, fleeing from terror and repression for which we're responsible. And in reaction, they're sending thousands of troops to the border.
As President Trump escalates his attacks against Central American migrants ahead of the midterm elections, we'll speak with the world-renowned dissident and linguist Noam Chomsky about U.S. foreign policy in Central America and Saturday's deadly Pittsburgh synagogue attack.
What we're now seeing is a revival of hate, anger, fear, much of it encouraged by the rhetorical excesses of the leadership.
Plus, we'll speak with the comedian and actress Ilana Glazer of Broad City fame. Last night, she was forced to cancel an event at a Brooklyn synagogue after a vandal scrawled, "Jew better be ready," and "End is now," among other anti-Semitic and racist graffiti on the building's walls.
For coming tonight, we have a situation that's not presenting any immediate danger, but there were hateful anti-Semitic scrawled all over the space today, very recently, within the past couple hours, so we don't feel safe.
Ilana Glazer will talk to us about what happened. Democracy Now! Was at the event. I was one of the people she was scheduled to interview about covering the midterm elections. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump is escalating his attacks against Central American migrant caravans making their way to the U.S.-Mexico border, including warning soldiers could shoot migrants for throwing rocks.
We're not going to put up with that. They want to throw rocks at our military fights back. We're going to consider it. I told them, consider it a rifle. When they throw rocks like they did at the Mexico military and police, I say, consider it a rifle.
President Trump has announced he may send as many as 15,000 troops to the border and indefinitely imprison asylum-seeking families in tent cities. This comes as a new Associated Press investigation has revealed over 56,000 migrants have died or gone missing worldwide over the last 4 years, as migration has surged by nearly 50% since the turn of the century. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, funerals continued Thursday for 3 more victims of Saturday's mass shooting at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, which killed 11 Jewish worshippers. Services were held for husband and wife Sylvan and Bernie Simon and Richard Gottfried. Robert Bowers pleaded not guilty Thursday. He's charged with 44 counts, including murder and hate crimes, over 30 of which could be subject to the death penalty. Bowers is accused of what has been described as the worst anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. Meanwhile, a fundraising campaign launched by 2 Muslim American groups in the aftermath of the mass shooting has raised over $220,000. The funds are helping families of the victims pay for their funerals. This comes as NBC News is reporting the Trump administration is ending a program that provides grants to groups fighting domestic terrorism. The Countering Violent Extremism Grant Program is run by the Department of Homeland Security and was established under the Obama administration. It supports groups fighting hate groups, including white supremacist, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic and racist groups. President Trump is reportedly planning on nominating State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert to be the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations after Nikki Haley's exit at the end of the year. Nauert is a former Fox News host, including for the program Fox and Friends, a favorite of Trump's. She joined the State Department as its spokesperson last year. In environmental news, the world's oceans are warming at a much faster rate than previously thought. That's according to a new report in the journal Nature, which finds that oceans have absorbed 60% more heat during the past 25 years than previous scientific estimates. Scientists say this will result in accelerated global warming as the heat is released into the atmosphere, making the target of holding global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit even more difficult to achieve unless urgent global action is taken. The Washington Post is reporting Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman tried to slander slain Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, falsely claiming the journalist was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood during a call with National Security Advisor John Bolton and White House senior advisor Jared Kushner in the days after Khashoggi's disappearance. The Muslim Brotherhood is classified by Saudi Arabia as a terrorist organization. Khashoggi was not a formal member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Today marks 1 month since Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and was assassinated. In news on Latin America, National Security Advisor John Bolton announced new sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba at a talk in Miami on Thursday, also singling out Nicaragua for possible future sanctions. He also praised far-right, newly elected Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro as a positive sign for the future of the region. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted Thursday its 27th annual resolution calling for an end to the U.S. economic embargo on Cuba. Both the United States and Israel voted no on the resolution. And in Brazil, far-right leader, President-elect Jair Bolsonaro, has confirmed that Sergio Moro, the crusading judge who convicted former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of corruption, will become his justice minister. After headlines, we'll speak with renowned dissident, professor, and author Noam Chomsky about Latin America and more. In Nigeria, suspected members of Boko Haram attacked 2 villages and a camp for internally displaced people in northeast Nigeria Wednesday, killing at least 15 people. Boko Haram has killed over 20,000 people and kidnapped thousands more since 2009. On Thursday, Google workers around the world walked out to protest the company's handling of sexual harassment and abuse. Democracy Now! Spoke with New York City Google employee and protester Dema Rodriguez.
We have decided that enough is enough is enough because everybody who works at Google has busted their backs, their lives, have sacrificed, have worked, have gotten the grades, have shown up in order to be the best at what they do. And it is unacceptable. It is absolutely disgusting that anyone thinks that you can be less than exceptional, and worse than that, you can be negligent about sexual assault, sexual harassment, abuse of power, inequities across every pillar that we have to no consequence. We will bring the consequences.
The protests came 1 week after the New York Times published a damning report detailing sexual misconduct at Google. A number of high-level male executives accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault have received millions in exit packages from Google. In election news, Oprah Winfrey joined Democratic gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams on the campaign trail in Marietta, Georgia, Thursday, days before the midterm elections in one of the country's most talked-about races.
I'm here today because of the men and because of the women who were lynched, who were humiliated, who were discriminated against, who were suppressed, who were repressed and oppressed for the right for the equality at the polls. And I want you to know that their blood has seeped into my DNA, and I refuse to let their sacrifices be in vain.
Oprah also told crowds she's not hitting the campaign trail to test the waters for her own political run. Back in the United States, Iowa Republican Congressmember Steve King lashed out at a college student at a campaign event in Des Moines, Iowa, Thursday for asking about how King's personal beliefs line up with those of the Pittsburgh shooter, Robert Bowers.
You and the shooter both share an ideology that is fundamentally anti-immigration.
Do not associate me with that shooter. I knew you were an ambusher when you walked in the room, but there's no basis for that, and you get no questions, you get no answers.
I was about to ask you what distinguishes your ideology.
Games here in Iowa.
I was about to ask you what distinguishes your ideology.
You crossed the line. It's not tolerable to accuse me to be associated with a guy that shot 11 people in Pittsburgh. I am a person who has stood with Israel from the beginning. The length of that nation is the length of my life.
That was Iowa State University student Caleb Van Fossen. He also tried to ask Congressmember Steve King about his recent trip to Austria, where King met with an Austrian neo-Nazi group. Earlier this week, the head of the National Republican Congressional Committee blasted King for his white supremacist ties, and corporate supporters of King, including Intel, Land O'Lakes, and Purina Pet Care, announced they would no longer fund King's campaigns. King is up for re-election, is polling just 1 point ahead of his Democratic challenger, J.D. Scholten, in a district that Trump won in 2016 by a 27% margin. And in New York, a political event hosted by Ilana Glazer of Comedy Central's Broad City at the Union Temple Synagogue in Brooklyn was canceled last night after anti-Semitic messages were found scrawled on walls throughout the building. Among the messages, "Jew better be ready," "Insert oven here," "End is now," "Hitler," and "Free smoke for N-word Jews." The N-word was written out. The graffiti comes amidst a surge in anti-Semitic hate crimes nationwide, including Saturday's massacre of 11 Jewish worshippers of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. I was scheduled to speak at Ilana Glazer's event about coverage of the midterm elections. On Thursday night, Glazer announced the cancellation to hundreds of people.
Hey, y'all. Thank you for coming tonight. We have a situation that's not presenting any immediate danger, but there were hateful anti-Semitic scrawled all over the space today, very recently, within the past couple hours. So we don't feel safe. This wasn't the event, you know what I mean? This is, but we are experiencing this together, and this is something for us to think about, gather around, organize, and activate. And we'll follow up with the story and who I was hoping to show you guys, these local candidates who are running tight races who need your help canvassing this weekend.
The Union Temple Synagogue in Brooklyn hosts outside events frequently, including an upcoming event commemorating the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, November 10th, 1938, when the glass of Jewish stores was smashed throughout Germany. Ilana Glazer will join us later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As President Trump escalates his attacks and threats against the Central American migrant caravans making their way to the U.S.-Mexico border, the Trump administration unveiled new sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba Thursday. National Security Advisor John Bolton declared Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua to be part of a troika of tyranny and a triangle of terror. Bolton was speaking in Miami, Florida.
We will no longer appease dictators and despots near our shores. We will not reward firing squads, torturers, and murderers. We will champion the independence and liberty of our neighbors. And this president and his entire administration will stand with the freedom fighters. The troika of tyranny in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, has finally met its match.
As John Bolton spoke in Miami on Thursday. Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh and I spoke with the world-renowned professor, linguist, and dissident Noam Chomsky. He joined us from Tucson, Arizona, where he now teaches at the University of Arizona. Noam Chomsky is also Institute Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's taught for more than 50 years. His recent books include Global Discontents, Conversations on the Rising Threats to Democracy, Who Rules the World, and Requiem for the American Dream, the 10 Principles of Concentration, Wealth, and Power. I began by asking Professor Chomsky to respond to NSA National Security Advisor John Bolton's remarks on Latin America.
Well, that, of course, immediately brings to mind the axis of evil speech of George Bush back in 2002, which was the precursor, laying the groundwork for the invasion of Iraq, the worst crime of this century, with horrendous consequences for Iraq, eliciting ethnic conflicts that are tearing the region apart, a major atrocity. John Bolton was behind that, and his new troika. I doubt that the U.S. will dare to do something similar, but that's what it brings to mind. It's kind of interesting to see this hysterical raving alongside of another astonishing propaganda campaign that Bolton and his colleagues are carrying out with regard to the caravan of poor and miserable people fleeing from severe oppression, violence, terror, extreme poverty from 3 countries: Honduras, mainly Honduras, secondarily Guatemala, thirdly El Salvador, not Nicaragua, incidentally. 3 countries that have been under harsh U.S. domination way back, but particularly since the 1980s, when Reagan's terror wars devastated particularly El Salvador and Guatemala, secondarily Honduras. Nicaragua was attacked by Reagan, of course, but Nicaragua was the one country which had an army to defend the population. In the other countries, the army were the state terrorists backed by the United States. The most extreme source of migrants right now is Honduras. Why Honduras? Well, it was always bitterly oppressed, but in 2009, Honduras had a mildly reformist president, Mel Zelaya. The Honduran powerful, rich elite couldn't tolerate that. A military coup took place, expelled him from the country. It was harshly condemned all through the hemisphere, with one notable exception: the United States. The Obama administration refused to call it a military coup, because if they had, they would have been compelled by law to withdraw military funding from the military regime, which was imposing a regime of brutal terror. Honduras became the murder capital of the world. A fraudulent election took place under the military junta, again harshly condemned all over the hemisphere, most of the world, but not by the United States. Obama administration praised Honduras for carrying out an election, moving towards democracy, and so on. Now people are fleeing from the misery and horrors for which we are responsible. And you have this incredible charade taking place, which the world is looking at with utter astonishment. Poor, miserable people, families, mothers, children, fleeing from terror and repression for which we're responsible. And in reaction, They're sending thousands of troops to the border. The troops being sent to the border outnumber the children who are fleeing. And with a remarkable PR campaign, they're frightening much of the country into believing that we're just on the verge of an invasion by Middle Eastern terrorists funded by George Soros, so on and so forth. I mean, it's all kind of reminiscent of something that happened 30 years ago. You may recall in 1985, Ronald Reagan strapped on his cowboy boots and got in front of television, called a national emergency because the Nicaraguan army was 2 days' march from Harlingen, Texas, just about to overwhelm and destroy us. And it worked. I mean, this spectacle is almost indescribable, even apart from noticing where they're coming from, the countries that we have crucially been involved in destroying. It's the ability to carry this off repeatedly is quite an amazing commentary on much of the popular culture. But the troika are just like the axis of evil, are those who just don't obey U.S. orders. Colombia, for example, has the worst human rights record in the hemisphere for years, but they're not part of the troika of tyranny. All of this rings very familiar bells. It's been a long-standing element of the U.S. propaganda system mostly on the far right, but not only, which goes way back, and which is a kind of pathological feature of the dominant political culture that should be understood, analyzed, and dismantled.
World-renowned professor, linguist, and dissident Noam Chomsky. When we come back, he'll share his reaction to the Pittsburgh massacre in the synagogue. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Somos el barco, somos el mar, yo navego en ti, tú navegas en mí.
Somos el barco, we are the boat, by Peter, Paul, and Mary. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The nation is continuing to grieve the 11 Jewish worshipers who were gunned down at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh Saturday, in what's being described as the worst anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. Funerals are held Thursday for 3 more victims of the shooting, husband and wife Sylvan and Bernie Simon and Richard Gottfried. Robert Bowers, who's accused of the mass shooting, pleaded not guilty Thursday. He's charged with 44 counts, including murder and hate crimes, over 30 of which could be subject to the death penalty. Bowers has a history of posting anti-Semitic and xenophobic content and was posting on the far-right social media site Gab until just before the shooting. He referred to the migrant caravan as an invasion, repeating the words that President Trump uses. We continue our conversation now with Noam Chomsky, the world-renowned professor, linguist, and dissident. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Chomsky was. I asked him about the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh and other recent right-wing attacks.
When I was a child, the threat that fascism might take over much of the world was not remote. That's much worse than what we're facing now. My own locality happened to be very anti-Semitic. We were the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood, much of which was pro-Nazi, so I could see it right on the ground. What we're now seeing is a revival of hate, anger, fear, much of it encouraged by the rhetorical excesses of the leadership, which are stirring up passions, terror, even the ludicrous claims about the Nicaraguan army ready to invade us, Ronald Reagan, the caravan of miserable people planning to kill us all. All of these things, plus, praising somebody who body slammed a reporter, one thing after another. All of this raises the level of anger and fear, which has roots. The roots lie in what has happened to the general population over the past 40 years. People really have faced significant distress. It's an astonishing fact about the United States is that life expectancy is actually declining. That doesn't happen in developed societies apart from major war or a huge famine. But it's happening because of social distress, and not necessarily impoverishment. The people who are demonstrating this fear and resentment may be even moderately affluent, but what they see is they're stagnating. In the past, there was, you had this dream, you worked hard, you could get ahead, your children would be a little better. Now it's stopped. It's stopped for the last 40 years as a result of very specific socioeconomic policies which have been designed so that they sharply concentrate wealth, they enhance corporate power, that has immediate effects on the political system in perfectly obvious ways, even to the point where lobbyists literally write legislation. This onslaught has literally cast much of the population aside. They're stagnating. They're not moving forward. They see no prospects. And they're bitter and angry about it. And this anger and bitterness can take pathological forms. It could take very constructive forms. It could lead to popular organized movements which would dedicate themselves to overcoming these blows against decent human existence, which certainly can be done. The groundwork for that has been severely undermined, for example, by the careful planned destruction of labor unions, the main force historically for leading the way towards more progressive, humane policies. All of these are a package. They've all gone together for 40 years, as precursors, of course, and it has led to a situation where you get an outburst of what Gramsci once called morbid symptoms, pathological developments of the kind that you mentioned, growing out of a soil that is rich in incitement to such things happening.
So And then if you could talk about specifically the targeting of the Jewish worshipers, I mean, and the clear connection that the shooter made between this temple and HIAS, what's formerly known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the group that has helped to resettle refugees of any religion for well over 100 years. And he repeated words that Trump has begun using more and more about, you know, they're helping the invaders come in. If you could respond specifically to that.
Well, I think it's pretty clear. These whipping up terror about invasions, people pouring across the border to plan to kill us all, to destroy our civilization. You take people who are already somewhat disturbed, living under harsh conditions. This can incite them to acts of extreme violence against targets like the Jewish temple. All the anti-Semitic tropes are pointing in that direction, but most also against Afro-Americans, immigrants, any vulnerable population or population that's easy to target for lots of cultural and historical reasons. All this amplified by the loudspeaker up in the White House and his minions, who are doing what they can to terrorize the population, create the conditions under which you can get something like the attack on the synagogue.
So I wanted to turn then to a clip of the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, who was interviewed by Eman Moildeen on MSNBC on Sunday. So it was soon after the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre. Dermer was asked if Trump's rhetoric is in part to blame for the massacre.
I see a lot of bad people on both sides who attack Jews. This is not the first time that a Jewish community has been attacked. It is the worst anti-Semitic attack in 200 years in the United States, that you have 11 dead.
Dermer said no world leader had made stronger statements against anti-Semitism than Trump. And then he went on to blame both sides.
To simply say that this is because of one person, or it only comes on one side, is to not understand the history of anti-Semitism or the reality of anti-Semitism. One of the big forces in college campuses today is anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semites are usually not neo-Nazis on college campuses. They're coming from the radical left.
This is right after the white supremacist attack on the synagogue, and the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. is now injecting, saying this comes from both sides. If you could respond to this, interestingly, 2 days later, when Trump and his family went to Pittsburgh, the only, and this is pointed out in the New York Times, the only public official standing there to greet him was Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer. People like the Pittsburgh mayor and the others said this was not the time to come.
Well, I think it's quite easy to understand. There is an alliance of reactionary, repressive states developing under the U.S. aegis. Israel is a leading member of it. Saudi Arabia is another, one of the most brutal, regressive, harsh states in the world. United Arab Emirates, Egypt under the harsh, brutal dictatorship. The United States, Israel and the United States, of course, very, especially under this, the alignment goes way back. But the Trump administration has gone way out of its way to lend support to Israeli crimes, Israeli expansion, and the Israeli right wing, of course, which is increasingly dominant, is delighted. So the fact that say the Israeli ambassador would come out and say that is really no more surprising than the fact that John Bolton would praise the election of a strong advocate of torture, murder, and repression. It all fits the same pattern.
This issue of the number of people who died this weekend, the horrific massacre, 11 Jews died, the model of the coverage of knowing who each person was, hearing their names, their life stories, their ages, who their families were, knowing when the funerals are taking place through the week. What about this being a model for what's happening in Gaza? I mean, for example, on, I think it was Friday, 6 Palestinians were killed with those ongoing protests near the separation wall. Israeli military has gunned down more than 200 Palestinians. That was Friday, 6 Palestinians died. And on Sunday, 3 Palestinian teenagers were killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Gaza Strip. Your thoughts on Dermer trying to make this connection, to get away from the issue of white supremacy, and somehow, some way, blame the left?
Well, remember, all of this in Gaza is being done with overwhelming U.S. support, even U.S. weapons, literally. Gaza is on the verge of becoming literally uninhabitable. The international monitors, UN and others, have warned that within just a few years, it may be literally unlivable. I mean, right now, there's virtually no potable water. The sewage pours into the sea because Israel has bombed and destroyed the power plants and the sewage plants. Back in 2005, when Israel withdrew its illegal settlers in Gaza and moved them to illegal settlements in the West Bank, it imposed a siege on Gaza. The official terms for that, official, I'm not making this up, are we have to impose a diet on Gaza, not harsh enough so they'll all die, implication being that wouldn't look very good, but harsh enough so that they can barely survive. And there have been, quite apart from the brutal siege, there have been repeated attacks on Gaza by the Israeli army. Gaza is virtually defenseless. This is one of the strongest armies in the world, lashing out to devastate Gaza. There's always pretexts. There are pretexts for everything. Hitler had a pretext for invading Poland. He was protecting Germany from the wild terror of the Poles. And the Israelis, with U.S. backing, have concocted pretexts. No time to go through it here. There's plenty in print about it. Every one of them collapses on inspection. It's just a punching bag. And the effect on the people of Gaza is to create utter desperation. The current march is just an attempt to somehow break the siege and make life possible. The problem could be overcome easily simply by providing them with the opportunities for survival. That's it. Not trying to block every attempt at political unification of the factions. It's often been a pretext for another attack. Some of what's going on parts of it we've seen are just grotesque, like when a highly trained Israeli sniper murders a young woman far from the border who's trying to help a Palestinian volunteer medic, young woman who's trying to help a wounded man, and a sniper murders her. Highly trained snipers, they know what they're doing. International monitors who've gone to the hospitals are shocked by the kinds of wounds they're finding, purposely designed to maim people so they'll barely, not kill them, but maim them so they won't be able to have even take part in the minimal life that exists there. Actually, Trump had a solution to this, to the misery of Gaza and the prospect that 2 million people, half of them children, will soon be in a situation of literal, beyond the possibility of survival. They had a lifeline, what it's called, the UNRWA support, international support, which was barely keeping them alive. So Trump's reaction is to cut it, cut support for it, and he even had a reason. He said, they're not being grateful enough to me for my efforts to give them the ultimate deal that I'm planning. Ultimate deal, which means give up all your rights and forget it. Two leading American political analysts, specialists on the Middle East with long government service, Robert Malley, Aaron David Miller, really encapsulated the Trump program very simply. He said the Trump message is to the Palestinians, you've lost, forget it, go away, you're done. And because the people of Gaza are not sufficient, on the West Bank, are sufficiently appreciative, let's cut the lifeline. In fact, let's even, as he did, cut support for underfunded Palestinian hospitals in the West Bank. Let's cut the funding for the UNRWA school in the Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon, still reeking from the hideous Israeli run massacre there back at the end of their invasion in '82. You see little kids playing in the mud in dark alleys. They'll never get out. Children will be there, and so on. They had one hope, the UNRWA school. Good, let's kill that. All of this, these things are just one after another taking place, indescribable. I mean, the war in Yemen, which finally, at last, is getting a little bit of attention, has been a major horror story. The most careful estimates of the killing that are now just coming out show that there may be 7 or 8 times as high as what has been the numbers that have been given. They're in the order of 70 or 80,000. The analysis of these Saudi emirate programs, a long study that came out of the Fletcher School of International Diplomacy at Tufts University recently, showed quite persuasively that the policies of the attackers are aimed at destroying the food supplies, making sure the population starves to death. They're also trying to close the port through which some supplies come. All of this is fully backed by the United States. U.S. and Britain secondarily supply the arms. The U.S. supplies the intelligence for the Saudi Air Force, which is carrying out massive atrocities. All of these things are happening. For years, they've been barely discussed. Now, finally, you're seeing pictures on the front page of starving Yemeni children. Even a call for a ceasefire, much belated, little attention to our crucial responsibility for it, just like our responsibility, which is overwhelming, for the plight of the miserable people trying to escape from the Troika, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, the 3 countries that have been completely under our thumb and are suffering bitterly for it, now trying to escape. So we turn them into an invasion mob planning to destroy us. All of this is surreal. It only is overshadowed by the failure to attend even minimally to the literal existential threats that are not remote.
Do you consider this one of the gravest times in your lifetime in U.S. politics now?
It's one of the gravest times in human history. Humans have been around for 200,000 years. For the first time in their history, they have to decide, and quickly, whether organized human society is going to survive for very long. And that's not in the remote distance. Again, there are two, with all the problems and horrors in the world, which should be attended to, there are two existential threats, both being increased. One is the threat of nuclear war, which is terminal. The other is the threat of severe environmental catastrophe, which doesn't destroy all human life, but does undermine the prospects for organized society. And you mentioned earlier a third threat, also dating back to the end of the Second World War. The end of the Second World War was the opening of the nuclear age. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a miracle that we've survived it. It's also the opening of what geologists are now calling the Anthropocene, the age in which human activity is radically affecting the environment. There's been debate about its origins. The World Geological Society more or less settled on the end of the end of the Second World War, the late 40s and on, where there was a sharp spike and damage to the environment. The third is what's called the sixth extinction, the extinction of species. The fifth extinction was around 65 million years ago, when it's assumed that a huge asteroid hit the Earth and ended the age of the dinosaurs. It destroyed most of the species on Earth. We're now in the midst of the sixth extinction, with very rapid destruction of other species and of the kind of environment in which they can survive, like wilderness, for example. We're pushing to the edge of not only our own survival, but that of much of life on Earth. So is it the most gravest moment in my life? Yes, but also in all of human history. And things like the election next week will have an impact on this.
World-renowned professor, linguist, and dissident Noam Chomsky, speaking to us from Tucson, Arizona, where he is now teaching at the University of Arizona. He is the Institute Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's taught for more than 50 years, has written over 100 books, was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We'll air more of the interview with Noam Chomsky next week. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Ilana Glazer joins us, yes, of Comedy Central, Broad City. But she'll be talking about serious things right now. She'll be talking about what happened last night and an event she had planned for a Brooklyn synagogue where she was going to be talking about politics before the midterms. The event had to be canceled because of anti-Semitic and racist graffiti that was scrawled just before the event around the synagogue. Stay with us.
I've got to know, yes, I've got to know, friend. Hungry lips ask me wherever I go. Comrades and friends all falling around me. I've got to know, yes, I've got to know. Why do your war boats ride on my waters? Why do your death bombs fall down from my skies? Tell me, why do you burn my farm and my town down? I've got to know, friend, I've got to know. I've got to know, yes, I've got to know, friend. Hungry lips ask me wherever I go.
I've Got to Know by Woody Guthrie. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show here in New York City, where a political event hosted by Ilana Glazer of Comedy Central's Broad City at the Union Temple Synagogue in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn, was canceled Thursday night after anti-Semitic and racist messages were found scrawled across walls throughout the building just before the event was to begin. Among the messages were, "Jew better be ready," "Insert oven here." Another said, as we walk through the halls, "End is now." Hitler. Another scrawled, "Free smoke for N-word Jews," and N-word was written out. And then there was one that said FPEEPR with what looked like a Puerto Rican flag. The graffiti comes amidst a surge in anti-Semitic hate crimes nationwide, including Saturday's massacre of 11 Jewish worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. I was scheduled to speak at Ilana Glazer's event last night to talk about coverage of the midterm elections and the coverage of grassroots movements leading up to it. On Thursday night, Ilana Glazer, after careful consideration, after looking at the graffiti, announced to the crowd of hundreds of people that she was canceling the event.
For coming tonight, we have a situation that that's not presenting any immediate danger, but there were hateful anti-Semitic scrawled all over the space today, very recently, within the past couple hours, so we don't feel safe.
The Union Temple Synagogue in Brooklyn hosts outside events frequently, including an upcoming event next week commemorating the anniversary of Kristallnacht. That's the Night of Broken Glass, November 10th, 1938, when the glass of Jewish stores was smashed throughout Germany. Well, for more, we're joined here in our New York studio by Ilana Glazer, co-creator and star of the hit Comedy Central show, Broad City. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Ilana.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me.
Well, it wasn't just a few hours ago that we were together last night at the synagogue. You were just about to hold this event, which you were really excited about, but then you got word what was scrawled through the stairwells and halls of the synagogue.
Yeah, so these Generator events, Generator is an online movement to encourage people to use their Instagram to talk about how policy affects their everyday lives and humanize policy. And then these live events, I've been interviewing politicians and activists to sort of hear and compare about how they both work for the people. This week started with it started and ended with white supremacy kind of ruining our programming. Last night was very, it was hard to tell. And every time we started talking about like what it could be, it just was like, no, we can't, I can't put these 200 people who came to listen in a safe space. I can't put them in that danger.
We just walked outside the green room, and we saw right by the all-gender bathroom the words scrawled kind of with magic marker, and it said "insert," but it left out the N. "Insert oven here."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was all. What was scary was that it was all over the building, and then the cops were kind of searching the building. It was too freaky. It was too freaky to hold it.
And there are a number of events in the building. And very interestingly, as we went outside, and hundreds of really disappointed people who were really galvanized for the midterm elections, I saw a sign outside, which we'll talk about in a second, that has to do with an event dealing with what happened back in 1939. But talk about, when you talk about the Generator series, what you mean.
So the Generator series is an in-person gathering of people who are part of this online community, who are willing to share part of their platform, because all of us have a platform now, with to discuss how policy affects, how the government affects our everyday lives. It feels so amorphous or philosophical until we hear about it, you know, affecting people's bodies, women's bodies, brown bodies, black bodies. And, you know, I think that we talk a lot in Generator about, like, not discussing politics growing up in the 90s. Don't talk about politics was like a phrase on the tip of everyone's tongue. And I think that's what's gotten us here today with this divisive country and this divisive political landscape and this sort of representation of a president, you know, but it's not really someone who's come up and understands policy and understands history or law. So it was interesting last night that it's like, you know, rather than sharing your story, we lived through a story. We lived through a safe, you know, physically benign version of a white supremacist act. And yeah, I had 4 events scheduled this week, and in the first event, this candidate had to pull out because I called his opponent a white supremacist on Instagram. He had to pull out. And I totally understood, and I had this like ideological crossroads, like, did I do the wrong thing? But that was my view. And that silenced this candidate, Perry Gershon, from coming. And last night, I was like so ready. I have these beautiful, bright people ready to go, ready to canvass, ready to do, you know, I intended to point people in the community to canvass, to knock on doors and change the local elections, to win to help, you know, progressive candidates who stand for human rights politics to win.
In New York and Long Island.
That's right. And I'm from Long Island, so it just has been like personal. And I've been in New York for the city for 13 years, so I just was very excited to point people in the right direction. And we saw as a community, the Generator community, we saw how white supremacy silences those politics and halts that action.
You know, people might be surprised to hear you talking so seriously, who are big fans of yours for Broad City. And, of course, you're a stand-up comic.
Yeah. You know, well, the Generator series has been funny because rather than stand-up, like, what's the context here? The context is I'm coming to see Ilana Glazer do stand-up. But with Generator, it's like the stakes are so high that the contrast of serious and comedy is so much greater. And there's actually a different kind of comedy that happens at Generator. But yeah, I'm passionate about.
But of course, last night there was not much humor.
No, it was. I mean, that was scary. That was actually just straight up scary. And you know, with the mass shooting last week. You know, it was like already eerie to be having these events in a synagogue. But, you know, our president's words and our politicians' words who stand for white supremacy, who stand for violence and aggression, like these words turn into action so quickly. We're seeing that happen now, and especially with no common sense gun laws, you know, that action can be serious very quickly. And we weren't gonna take that risk.
You refer a lot to your Jewish identity in Broad City. As we just have a minute to go, your final thoughts on what this all means. And again, there were other slur words too, like the N-word.
Yeah, you know, I do. My Jewish identity means a lot to me, and you know, I implore other Jews to align themselves with those who are also othered in this country. You know, this country was built on the backs of black and brown bodies, and Jews are in this weird middle space, but we are all othered, but we are all, as a unit, we are strong and can stand up and make change in these midterm elections. I hope that we do. I really hope that we do. Our voices matter, and we have to be a little more strategic about our safety, but we can make change very
Ilana
imminently.
Glazer, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Ilana Glazer, comedian, writer, actress, co-creator, star of the hit Comedy Central show Broad City. You can go to our website to see the images at democracynow.org. A very fond farewell to our dear producer, Laura Gottesdiener. I have no words. Thank you so much for all of your contributions here over these years. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Laura Gottesdiener, Nermin Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.